During our trip to New York and the visit to the United Nations headquarters, I have learned a number of things about the UN that we have not much covered in class. I learned that one of the ways in which the UN helps during a conflict is by making the world aware about the ongoing events so they can receive donations as well as volunteers in order to help the country or the population in need. The detailed information about the many conflicts occurring around the world is publicly available on their website. I was also made aware of certain ways in which the UN intervene in a conflict. For example, during a civil war, in order to send humanitarian aid, they need to have a green light from the government of the concerned country. But when the humanitarian aid is destined for the opposing side, the government might not allow the UN to proceed. In order to bypass that, the Security Council can vote to enact the Chapter 7, which allows them to send humanitarian aid disregarding the government's decision. Finally, I've also learned a number of things concerning the United Nations actions undertaking to help Syria in their civil war. 11.5% of the Syrian population is in desperate need of aid. Providing this aid is proving to be very difficult as convoys often get stopped at the checkpoints, the government often opposes the sending of aid to the opposing side, and the convoys sometimes get attacked on the way, such as the case that happened a week before our visit to the UN. The only way this conflict can be resolved is by making the two sides talk and come to a political decisions to stop this conflict. Military intervention by the countries involved in this war only diminishes the chances of a peaceful agreement until the whole country is razed to the ground. I've also realized that the United Nations actually have very little power to really influence a conflict, which makes the goal of keeping the world's peace an even greater task. Often, the obstacles themselves come from within the UN members, precisely due to the permanent members of the Security Council, which are the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, China, and France. For example, Russia is utilizing its veto power during the Syrian war, which sometimes fueled the conflict even more. During the conference that we had at the United Nations headquarters, I've also learned from a UN employee who was very knowledgeable about the Syrian conflict that this veto power needs to somehow change, as it often prevents peaceful resolutions of certain conflicts. The idea was already uttered, but unfortunately, according to him, it is probably not soon that we'll see any change in the veto powers of a permanent member. Also, I noticed that the symbolism plays a big part in the way the United Nations headquarters are arranged. For example, at a certain entrance to a conference room, the diplomats would see a painting representing war, which shows them the challenges that they have before them, and reminding them what they are trying to prevent or stop. Upon the exit of the room, the diplomats will see a painting representing peace, signifying the results towards which they are working. This trip to New York offered us a different and interesting way of studying international relations. I found that by actually visiting the United Nations, we really got the feeling of the importance of their mission, which we couldn't really feel as much from the theory that we've acquired in class. Consequently, by visiting the places where the world leaders assemble to talk about the issues around the world, really gives me a bigger perspective on how these decisions are made. Furthermore, by seeing the gifts adoring the structure given by different members of the United Nations, really showed how much of a vast alliance that is, as well as making me realize the collective effort that countries give to allow peace to exist. All these things are learned in class, but not really felt as if when you visit the actual place. Finally, I also visited the Intrepid, which is a decommissioned World War II American air carrier, and the Growler, which is an American Cold War submarine capable of launching a nuclear strike. These two visits helped me realize and really see what kind of threats and monsters even the United Nations are trying to keep at bay through their peacekeeping missions. Something that again we've seen in class but couldn't really feel it. Also, what I really appreciated from this way of learning is that we are not focused on one particular subject but are free to explore other things. For example, I noticed some variations in the cultures between Canadians and Americans, in the way they dress, talk, try to sell their products, and generally by a different way of life. Through the visit to the American Museum of Natural History, I learned a little more about history, which, by the way, is my favorite subject. To add to that, I noticed differences in ways of marketing in New York, and at some level also the city's different architecture and structure. To conclude, this trip not only allowed me to further my knowledge of politics, but also in history, culture, architecture, and marketing, something that is not possible within the premise of a usual class.